The village of St. Mary Mead was basking in the glow of a golden, late summer afternoon. The gardens were in full bloom. Neatly trimmed hedges stood in perfect symmetry, and the air carried the faintest scent of honeysuckle. The church bell had just chimed 3 o'clock when Mrs. Sylvia Arkwright, longtime resident of the village, stepped onto the neatly paved road leading to the post office. She held a small brown envelope in one gloved hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. Mrs. Arkwright was a woman of precision. She prided herself on keeping to a strict schedule. Every afternoon, after finishing her tea, she would take a leisurely walk to the post office, where she would either send or collect letters. Today's errand was no different, except for the slight tension in her manner, the way her fingers gripped the paper a little too tightly, the occasional glance over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to follow. She entered the post office, greeted by the familiar scent of old paper and ink. Miss Iris Lonsdale, the postmistress, looked up from behind the wooden counter. She was a woman in her late 30s, with a sharp, no-nonsense manner. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Arkwright," she said briskly. "Something to send today?" "Yes," Sylvia replied, forcing a smile as she unfolded the paper. "A telegram." Miss Lonsdale took the slip and adjusted her spectacles. As she read, a slight crease formed between her brows. "This is rather urgent, isn't it?" she observed. Sylvia hesitated. "Yes, it must go out immediately." Miss Lonsdale nodded and reached for her pen. "To whom shall I send it?" But before Sylvia could answer, the door of the post office burst open with a loud creak. Both women turned sharply to see Major Geoffrey Endicott, a retired military officer with a brash, commanding presence, stride in. He was a fixture of the village. I was seen walking his Labrador along the common or holding court at the pub, recounting his war stories to anyone who would listen. "Ah, Mrs. Arkwright," he boomed. Good afternoon. I do hope I'm not interrupting." Sylvia stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Not at all, Major," she said coolly, folding the telegram slip back into her handbag in one smooth motion. "I was just about to leave." Miss Lonsdale looked between them, sensing an unspoken tension. Sylvia gave her a small nod, as if to say the telegram could wait, and with that she turned and walked out, her steps brisker than before. Major Endicott, oblivious to war, perhaps entirely aware of the moment he had just interrupted, leaned over the counter. "You wouldn't happen to have a copy of the Times left, would you?" he asked. Miss Lonsdale handed him a newspaper, her thoughts still lingering on the telegram that had not been sent. That night, darkness settled over St. Mary Mead. A storm rolled in from the west. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and rain began to fall in steady sheets. In a small, neatly kept cottage at the edge of the village, Sylvia Arkwright sat alone in her sitting room, single lamp casting a pool of light over the letter she now held in her hands. A knock sounded at the door. Sylvia started, her heart hammering. She set the letter down carefully and rose. Another knock, firmer this time. She hesitated, then crossed the room and opened the door. A figure stood silhouetted against the storm. A breath of wind rushed past them, making the candle on the nearby table flicker. "You?" Sylvia whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. The next morning, when Mrs. Edith Pringle, the Arkwrights' housekeeper, arrived promptly at 8, she found the house unsettlingly silent. She knocked on the door. No answer. With growing unease, she tried the handle. It turned easily. Stepping inside, she called out, "Mrs. Arkwright." Still nothing. She moved through the house, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. When she reached the sitting room, she froze. Sylvia Arkwright was slumped over her writing desk, her head resting on her folded arms. A single candle had burned down to its stub, wax hardened in uneven dribbles down the holder, and on the desk, right next to her hand, was a sheet of paper with hurried, uneven writing. A letter, unfinished. Mrs. Pringle took an unsteady step forward. A tad. And then she saw the overturned bottle of sleeping tablets in Sylvia Arkwright's cold, lifeless hand. St. Mary Mead had always been a village where little went unnoticed. The moment Mrs. Pringle ran from the Arkwright house, her apron flapping, her face white as a sheet, the wheels of village gossip were set into motion. By mid-morning, the tragic news had spread. Mrs. Sylvia Arkwright was dead. Inspector Harold Craythorne arrived at the Arkwright residence just past 11. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, with a serious demeanor and a preference for getting straight to the point. He stood in the modest sitting room, his sharp gaze sweeping over the scene. Dr. Adam Redfern, the village physician, had already examined the body and now stood beside him, adjusting his spectacles. "It appears to be a case of suicide, Doctor," Redfern remarked. "Overdose of sleeping tablets." The bottle was right there on the desk, half its contents gone. Craythorne made a low noise of skepticism. "And the letter?" Redfern nodded toward the sheet of paper on the desk, still resting beside Sylvia's outstretched hand. The inspector stepped forward, his eyes scanning the uneven handwriting. "I have no choice but to." The words trailed off, the pen having skidded to a stop mid-sentence. "No choice but to what?" Craythorne muttered. "And why stop writing, Adar?" Redfern cleared his throat. The amount of the drug in her system was significant. She likely began feeling its effects while she was writing and lost consciousness before she could finish. Craythorne looked around the room. Everything was in perfect order except for one thing. The window on the far side of the room was slightly ajar, rainwater from last night's storm forming a small puddle on the sill. He frowned. Did Mrs. Arkwright often leave her windows open at night? Mrs. Pringle, standing near the door, clasped her hands together. "No, sir. She was always particular about closing them before bed." Craythorne exchanged a glance with Redfern, a small detail, but a curious one. He turned his attention back to Mrs. Pringle. "When was the last time you saw her?" "Yesterday afternoon, sir, just before tea. She seemed unsettled. I didn't ask why, of course, but she was quieter than usual." Craythorne tapped a finger against the letter. "Did she seem distressed?" "The sort of distress that might lead to this." Mrs. Pringle hesitated, her wrinkled face lined with uncertainty. I don't know. She was worried about something, I think, but suicide." She shook her head. "It doesn't seem like her, sir." The inspector nodded thoughtfully, then turned to Constable James Hargreaves, who had been taking notes. "In the background, we'll need to speak to those who saw her last." Hargreaves nodded. "She went to the post office yesterday afternoon, sir. According to Miss Lonsdale, she wanted to send a telegram, but she never did." Craythorne's brow furrowed. "Never sent it?" "No, sir. The moment Major Endicott walked in, she put it away and left." Craythorne frowned. "We'll need to see that telegram." Hargreaves hesitated. "A T wasn't left behind, sir." Craythorne swore under his breath. He had worked enough cases to know that people rarely took their own lives without leaving a clear explanation. This letter, unfinished, vague, didn't sit right with him. And neither did the missing telegram. Across the village, in a quaint house covered in climbing roses, Miss Jane Marple sat with her knitting, the morning light streaming in through lace curtains. She had heard the news, of course. The whole village had. Her dear friend, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, had been the first to call on her that morning. "It's all anyone can talk about, Jane. Poor Sylvia Arkwright. And such a shock. I saw her just yesterday, looking perfectly well." Miss Marple nodded. "So they say it was suicide." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her blue eyes alight with curiosity. "Dr. Redfern believes so, but I can't help thinking it's all very odd." "Odd? In what way, dear?" "Well, Mrs. Bantry began. For one thing, Why would she be sending a telegram if she planned to end her life that very night? Miss Marple's fingers stilled over her knitting. Indeed, she murmured. Mrs. Bantry continued. And why leave an unfinished letter? If she had something to say, surely she would have made sure to say it properly. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. And did anyone see her in the evening? Oh, yes. Few people heard a visitor at her house. No one saw who it was. Candace's wife, who was passing by on her way home, swears she saw a shadow at Sylvia's door just after dark. Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. Now, that is interesting, she set her knitting aside. Dolly, my dear, I think it would be most useful to pay a visit to poor Sylvia's house. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple arrived at Sylvia Arkwright's cottage. She was greeted by Mrs. Pringle, who, having known Miss Marple for years, was more than happy to let her inside. The sitting room was just as it had been described. The letter still sat on the desk, the ink slightly smudged from where it had bled into the paper. Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes took in every detail. The neatness of the room. The candle burned almost to its base. The open window. She approached the desk and lightly ran a finger over the letter. She wrote this shortly. Before her death, you say? Mrs. Pringle nodded. A tease, what Dr. Redfern said. Miss Marple peered closer. And yet, how very strange. Mrs. Pringle frowned. What is Miss Marple? The elderly lady pointed to the inkwell. The ink is almost dry, isn't it? Well, yes, Mrs. Pringle said slowly. Miss Marple tilted her head. Then why is the blotting paper missing? Mrs. Pringle's mouth opened, but no words came. Miss Marple turned her attention to the window. She moved closer, examining the rain-splattered sill. And this was open when you arrived. Mrs. Pringle nodded. Miss Marple's gaze swept downward, landing on the floor beneath the window. She bent down and, with surprising agility, picked up a small, nearly unnoticeable object. A tiny splinter of glass. Miss Marple studied it for a moment before slipping it into her handkerchief. Mrs. Pringle, my dear, I do believe Sylvia Arkwright did not take her own life. Mrs. Pringle gasped. But then, how did she die? Miss Marple turned, her expression unreadable. I suspect, my dear, that someone made quite sure she wouldn't send that telegram. Inspector Harold Craythorne was not a man who liked complications. Straightforward case suited him best, one with clear motives, obvious suspects, and little room for doubt. But as he sat at his desk in the small police station, reviewing his notes on Sylvia Arkwright's death, us crept into his mind. The circumstances, on the surface, pointed to suicide. A widow, living alone, perhaps overwhelmed by some private despair. But then there was the unfinished letter, the unsent telegram, the open window, troubling of all the quiet certainty in Miss Jane Marple's voice when she had declared, I do believe Sylvia Arkwright did not take her own life. Miss Marple was a woman of unassuming presence, with the look of a kindly grandmother more suited to baking scones than solving crimes. Yet Craythorne had learned enough about her to know that beneath her delicate lace collars and soft-spoken manner lay a mind as sharp as a needle. If she suspected foul play, he could not afford to dismiss her. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the notes before him. If Sylvia Arkwright had not taken her own life, then someone had wanted it to appear that way. The question was who? Miss Marple, having spent the morning observing the details of Sylvia Arkwright's home, took her usual afternoon walk through St. Mary Mead. The village was alive with hushed conversations about the tragedy. Miss Marple, well practiced in the art of listening without appearing to do so, gathered several interesting pieces of information. Mrs. Leslie, the baker's wife, had seen Sylvia the previous afternoon, standing outside the post office with a troubled expression. Miss Hartnell, the retired school mistress, remarked that Sylvia had recently received a visitor, a man, but no one seemed to know who he was. And Major Geoffrey Endicott, a well-known figure in the village, had been seen entering the post office at the very moment Sylvia decided against sending her telegram. It was this last detail that Miss Marple found most intriguing. She had known Major Endicott for years, a retired military man. He was prone to fits of temper and held rigid views on duty and propriety. He had once been quite friendly with Sylvia Arkwright, but something had caused a rift between them in recent months. Deciding that a friendly call was in order, Miss Marple made her way to the Major's house. Major Endicott's residence was a tidy affair, with an immaculately trimmed lawn and a Union Jack flying proudly from a flagpole. He himself answered the door, his posture as straight as ever, though his face showed signs of age and weariness. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said gruffly. Come in. Bit of a shock about Sylvia. What?" Miss Marple followed him into the sitting room, where a brandy decanter stood half empty on the sideboard. "Yes, indeed," she said, settling into a chair. "Such a terrible thing, and unexpected." The Major harrowed. Didn't think she had it in her, to be frank. Always seemed a sensible woman. Miss Marple regarded him with mild interest. "Teen, and yet, I understand you saw her at the post office yesterday." The Major's expression shifted slightly. "Yes, I did." She looked upset. "I asked if she was all right, but she brushed me off, said she had a matter to attend to." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "I heard she intended to send a telegram, but changed her mind when you arrived." The Major frowned. Well, yes, I suppose that's true. Thought it odd at the time." Miss Marple smiled gently. "What do you think she might have been trying to communicate?" Endicott's eyes darted away. "No idea," he muttered. "We hadn't spoken much lately." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers working deftly. It must have been very troubling for her, whatever it was, to change her mind so suddenly, almost as if she were afraid. The Major shifted uncomfortably. "Okay, see here, Miss Marple, if you're suggesting." "Oh, I never suggest, dear." "Major," Miss Marple said sweetly, "I simply observe." She allowed a moment of silence to pass, then changed the subject to the weather. The Major relaxed slightly, but Miss Marple had already noted his reaction. That evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fireplace with a cup of tea, she reviewed what she had learned. Sylvia Arkwright had been distressed. She had attempted to send a telegram, but had abandoned the idea when Major Endicott arrived. That same evening, someone had visited her home, and by morning she was dead. Then there was the matter of the open window and the missing blotting paper. Miss Marple took a sip of tea. Someone was in that room, she murmured to herself. And they made sure Sylvia never sent that telegram. The question remained, who? More importantly, what had Sylvia Arkwright wanted to say? The morning mist lingered over St. Mary Mead, casting a gray pallor over the cottages and winding lanes. Miss Marple, clad in a neat woolen cardigan, made her way to the post office, where the ever-watchful Miss Emily Jacobs presided over the village's correspondence with meticulous care. Miss Jacobs, a woman of advanced years with an uncanny memory for the comings and goings of her patrons, was arranging a stack of envelopes when Miss Marple entered. She brightened immediately, adjusting her spectacles. "Miss Marple, what a morning, isn't it? Such terrible news about Mrs. Arkwright." Miss Marple sighed gently. "Yes, my dear, a very sad affair. I was just thinking about poor Sylvia yesterday, and how she must have felt, standing here, uncertain whether to send that telegram." Miss Jacobs pursed her lips. "Oh, I did think it strange." She wrote it out quite quickly, but then, just as I was about to take it, she hesitated. And then Major Endicott came in, and she folded it right up, as if she'd changed her mind all at once. Miss Marple's needles clicked in her bag. "Did you happen to see what she had written?" Miss Jacobs looked scandalized. "Miss Marple, you know very well I would never pry into private matters." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Of course, but I do wonder." Was the telegram addressed locally, or perhaps further afield? Miss Jacobs hesitated, then lowered her voice. London, I believe. She didn't write the full address before she changed her mind, but I distinctly saw London W1 before she folded it away. Miss Marple considered this. London W1 a central district. Sylvia had been reaching out to someone in such a location. It suggested business of some importance. She seemed rather nervous, don't you think? Miss Marple mused. Miss Jacobs nodded. She did. But then, lately, she often looked troubled, ever since that gentleman started coming round. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her ears caught the slight edge of disapproval in Miss Jacobs's voice. A gentleman. Miss Jacobs sniffed. A stranger. Not from around here. He visited her house twice, I believe. Tall, fair-haired, and quite well-dressed. But I can't say I liked the look of him. Had a sharp sort of face, if you know what I mean. Miss Marple did know what she meant. Did they seem on good terms? Miss Jacobs considered. It's hard to say. It's the first time I saw them. They were just talking at the gate. The second time, I thought they were arguing. She looked pale when he left. That was about a week ago. Miss Marple patted Miss Jacobs's hand. You've been very helpful, my dear. Such a memory for details. You really ought to have been a detective. Miss Jacobs beamed at the compliment, though she quickly masked her pleasure with a modest shrug. Miss Marple left the post office deep in thought. A stranger, visiting Sylvia Arkwright twice. A disagreement. A telegram that never got sent. And then her sudden death. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a short journey to visit Colonel Melrose, Chief Constable of the county, who had always maintained a certain fondness for her sharp mind. His study, a dark, wood-paneled room filled with books and hunting trophies, was a familiar setting for her. Well, Jane, he said, pouring them each a cup of tea, I hear you've been making inquiries about Sylvia Arkwright. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Not inquiries, dear Colonel, just observations. He chuckled. Okay. And what have you observed? Okay. That Sylvia was troubled before her death. Miss Marple said simply. Okay. That she wished to send a telegram, but was afraid to. That a stranger visited her recently and left her looking unwell. Colonel Melrose nodded. The doctor says it was poisoning. Lethal dose, most likely taken in her tea, but there's no indication of forced entry or struggle. Miss Marple nodded. Then she knew her killer. Melrose frowned. You don't believe it was suicide? Miss Marple gave him a kindly look. Sylvia Arkwright had made a decision to act. She had written that telegram for a reason. People who take their own lives don't typically make plans for the future. Colonel Melrose sighed. You always see what others miss, Jane. If this was murder, I'll need to question those closest to her. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Perhaps, but I wonder if it might be more useful to question those she had recently quarreled with. That evening, just as Miss Marple was settling in with her knitting, a knock came at her door. It was Inspector Craythorne, looking grimmer than usual. There's been another death, he said without preamble. Miss Marple put down her knitting. Oh dear. Craythorne took a deep breath. Major Endicott, found in his sitting room an hour ago. Brandy glass beside him. Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. Poison. Craythorne nodded. Looks that way. It's whatever's happening in this village, Miss Marple. It's not over yet. Miss Marple, for once, said nothing. But in her mind, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to shift into place. The news of Major Endicott's death sent shockwaves through St. Mary Mead. That a second death could follow so soon after Sylvia Arkwright's was more than the villagers could bear. The usual gossip and speculation had given way to real fear. Was there a madman among them, or was something far more sinister at play? Miss Marple sat in her cozy sitting room, her knitting needles resting idly in her lap. She had long since learned that crimes of passion and greed were rarely as random as they appeared. Hey, There was a connection between the two deaths, and it was only a matter of uncovering what it was. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When she opened it, she found Reverend Leonard Clement standing on her doorstep. His usual calm demeanor replaced by a look of deep concern. "Miss Marple," he said, stepping inside. "I don't wish to trouble you, but I had to speak with someone who might make sense of this dreadful business." She gestured for him to sit. "I quite understand, Reverend. A terrible thing indeed. What is it that troubles you?" He hesitated, then leaned forward. "Something Major Endicott said to me not 2 days ago. At the time, I thought little of it, but now—" Miss Marple gave him an encouraging nod. "He was in church on Sunday," Reverend Clement continued. "After the service, he lingered, as if he wished to speak to me, and then, quite suddenly, he said, 'Reverend, do you think it is ever too late to right a wrong?'" Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And what did you say?" "I told him, of course, that repentance is always possible, that one should seek to atone for past sins." Reverend Clement sighed. He seemed troubled, deeply troubled. "I asked him if he wished to confess something, but he shook his head and walked away. And now he's dead." Miss Marple pressed her hands together. "Did he say anything else?" Reverend Clement shook his head. "Only that, but it struck me as an odd thing for him to ask." Major Endicott was not a particularly pious man, but he seemed burdened. Miss Marple thought for a moment. "I believe, Reverend, that Major Endicott had uncovered something that frightened him, and he wished to set it right. But what could that have been?" Reverend Clement asked. "That," Miss Marple said softly, "is what we must find out." The next morning, Miss Marple took a quiet stroll to Major Endicott's cottage. It was a modest home, set back from the road, with neatly trimmed hedges and an air of military orderliness. A constable stood outside, but upon seeing Miss Marple, he gave a respectful nod and let her pass. Inside, Inspector Craythorne was already there, examining the study where the Major had been found. Papers were strewn across the desk, and a half-written letter lay beside the empty brandy glass. Miss Marple peered at the letter, careful not to touch it. The ink was smudged in places, as if the Major's hand had been unsteady. Inspector Craythorne read aloud, "I can no longer keep silent. It is time the truth was known, no matter the cost. I have wrestled with my conscience, but there is no other way. Tomorrow I shall." The sentence ended abruptly. Miss Marple glanced at the inspector. Tomorrow? He would have done what, I wonder? Craythorne exhaled sharply. "Looks like someone didn't want him to finish that thought." Miss Marple studied the papers on the desk. "Did you find anything else?" The inspector nodded. "A bank statement. He withdrew a large sum of money last week's £500, and yet there's no record of where it went." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly. "That is a great deal of money, particularly for a man who lived as modestly as Major Endicott." Craythorne agreed. "It must have gone somewhere, or to someone." Miss Marple picked up a small photograph that had been lying face down. It was an old picture, slightly faded, of a younger Major Endicott standing beside another man, a tall, fair-haired gentleman with sharp features. She turned to the inspector. "Have you identified this man?" Craythorne shook his head. "Not yet, but we will." Miss Marple placed the photograph back on the desk. "I believe, Inspector, that whoever this man is, he holds the key to the mystery." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Miss Jacobs at the post office once more. "My dear," she said kindly, "I have a rather curious question for you." Miss Jacobs adjusted her spectacles. "Ask away, Miss Marple." "A telegram that Sylvia Arkwright nearly sent you. You recall what time of day it was?" Miss Jacobs thought for a moment. "Why, yes, it was around 4:30. It's just before tea time." Miss Marple nodded. "And tell me, Do you know if Major Endicott received any letters or telegrams that day? Jacobs frowned. Now that you mention it, he did receive a telegram that very afternoon. I remember, because he looked quite alarmed when he read it. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Did you happen to see who it was from? Miss Jacobs hesitated. I shouldn't say, Miss Marple, but under the circumstances. She lowered her voice. It was from London. From someone named Devereux. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with recognition. A Devereux. The name was familiar, and suddenly she remembered where she had heard it before, many years ago. A scandal had rocked the London financial world embezzlement case involving a certain Arthur Devereux, a man who had vanished before he could be brought to justice, and now, it seemed, he had resurfaced. Miss Marple turned to Miss Jacobs. Thank you, my dear. You've been most helpful. As she walked back home, Miss Marple felt a sense of growing certainty. The pieces were falling into place. Sylvia Arkwright had hesitated to send a telegram. Major Endicott had received one and died shortly after. Both deaths were connected to a long-buried secret, and now the name Devereux had returned. Miss Marple knew what she had to do next. Miss Marple returned home deep in thought, her steps measured as she walked through the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead. The name Devereux had stirred something in her memory. And now she was certain this case was not merely one of sudden violence or personal quarrels. It was tied to a past deception, a long-hidden crime that had only now begun to unravel. Settling into her chair with a fresh cup of tea, she allowed her mind to drift back through the years. Arthur Devereux. Yes, she had read about him in the papers, an unscrupulous financier accused of embezzling thousands of pounds. A scandalous case, but one that had ended strangely. Before he could be arrested, Devereux had disappeared. Some believed he had fled abroad, while others suspected he had died under an assumed name. But now, after all these years, his name had surfaced once again in connection with two debts in sin. Mary Mead. She took a sip of tea, her sharp eyes narrowing. If Arthur Devereux was indeed alive, what had brought him here? And why had Sylvia Arkwright and Major Endicott died so soon after his reappearance? The next morning, she made her way to the village library. The old newspapers were kept in bound volumes, and Miss Marple was always pleased by how much history could be gleaned from their pages. With practiced efficiency, she found what she was looking for, an article from nearly 20 years ago, detailing the collapse of Devereux's investment firm. She ran a finger down the text until she found the information she needed. Devereux had had a business partner, a man named Geoffrey Henshaw. Unlike Devereux, Henshaw had been arrested, but had insisted throughout his trial that he was innocent. He claimed Devereux had orchestrated everything and that he himself had been left to take the blame. But the courts had been unsympathetic, and Henshaw had been sentenced to prison. Miss Marple frowned slightly. Henshaw's name was unfamiliar to her, which meant he had not made headlines after his release, but she knew how to find out more. Leaving the library, she paid a visit to the one person who, if anyone in the village knew, might have heard something of Henshaw's whereabouts. Miss Jacobs at the post office greeted her with a polite smile. Back again, Miss Marple. More telegram business. Miss Marple gave a slight chuckle. In a way, my dear. But I was wondering if you might help me with something else. Have you ever heard the name Geoffrey Henshaw? Miss Jacobs frowned, tapping her fingers on the counter. Henshaw, that does ring a bell. Let me think. She pursed her lips for a moment, then her eyes brightened. Oh, now I remember. There was a man moved to the area about 5 or 6 years ago. Kept to himself, mostly. He went by the name Mr. Henry Shaw. Miss Marple smiled gently. Interesting choice of name. Henshaw, Henry Shaw. A little too close to be a coincidence, wouldn't you say? Miss Jacobs gasped. Do you mean? Oh, my goodness. You think he's the same man? Strongly suspected, Miss Marple replied. And tell me, Miss Jacobs, does Mr. Shaw still live in the village? Miss Jacobs shook her head. No, he left a couple of years ago. But I believe he still keeps a cottage just outside of town. Only comes back on occasion. Miss Marple nodded, absorbing this information. If Henshaw, now Henry Shaw, was still connected to the area, then he too might have crossed paths with Major Endicott. And perhaps even with Sylvia Arkwright. With quiet determination, Miss Marple set off towards the outskirts of the village where Mr. Shaw's cottage stood. It was a small, neat home with ivy creeping up its stone walls. There was no sign of life, but that did not deter her. She approached the door and knocked firmly. After a pause, she heard slow, shuffling footsteps. The door opened just a crack, revealing an older man with tired, wary eyes. Yes, his voice was gruff, as though he had grown unused to conversation. Miss Marple gave her warmest smile. Mr. Shaw, I presume. His eyes flickered with suspicion. Who's asking? My name is Miss Marple, she said pleasantly. I was hoping to ask you a few questions about an old acquaintance of yours, a man named Arthur Devereux. The reaction was immediate. Mr. Shaw's face went pale, and the door, which had been slightly ajar, began to close. I don't know anything about that, he muttered. You're mistaken. I don't think I am, Miss Marple said gently. I believe you knew Arthur Devereux very well, and I think you may have learned something recently, something that frightened you. His grip on the door tightened. I don't want any trouble. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Mrs. Shaw, 2 people are dead, and I think you may hold the key to understanding why. The silence stretched between them. Then, with a reluctant sigh, Mr. Shaw opened the door wider and stepped back. Come in, he said gruffly. I don't know how much help I'll be. Miss Marple entered, taking in the modest furnishings. It was the home of a man who had lived quietly, trying to escape his past. Mr. Shaw gestured for her to sit, then lowered himself into an armchair. I suppose there's no use denying it. I was Geoffrey Henshaw once, but I left all that behind. Wanted no part in what Devereux did. Miss Marple nodded. But you heard from him recently, didn't you? Shaw's fingers twitched slightly. Not directly, but someone left a message for me. A warning. Miss Marple leaned forward. A warning. Shaw hesitated, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He handed it to her, and she unfolded it carefully. The message was written in neat, slanted handwriting. The past is not forgotten. Beware those who seek the truth. Miss Marple read it twice before looking up. When did you receive this? 3 days ago, Shaw said. Left on my doorstep. No signature. No explanation. Miss Marple's mind word. 3 days ago, just before Sylvia Arkwright had died, a pattern was beginning to form, and she had a strong suspicion about what it meant. But she needed more information before she could be certain. She rose from her chair. Mr. Shaw, I must thank you. You've been most helpful. He gave a bitter chuckle. I don't know how. All I've done is bring old ghosts back to life. Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. Ghosts can be quite persistent, Mr. Shaw, and sometimes they demand justice. As she stepped outside, she glanced once more at the note in her hand. The past is not forgotten. Indeed, it never was. And now, Miss Marple was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. Miss Marple walked back to the village with measured steps, her mind carefully piecing together the puzzle. The past was never truly buried, and now it was clear that old crimes had come back to haunt those involved. Geoffrey Henshaw, now calling. Himself, Henry Shaw, had received a warning just days before Sylvia Arkwright's murder. Was it a coincidence? Miss Marple did not believe in coincidences. She decided it was time to visit Inspector Craddock. The inspector, though competent, often overlooked the subtleties of human behavior that Miss Marple found so telling. If he was close to drawing a conclusion, she feared it might be the wrong one. At the police station, she was met by a young constable who regarded her with polite curiosity. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Here to see the inspector." "Yes, if he's not too busy," she said with a kind smile. The constable nodded and disappeared into the back room. Moments later, Inspector Craddock emerged, looking both pleased and wary. "Miss Marple, something tells me you've uncovered something." Miss Marple settled herself in the chair he offered. "I wouldn't be so bold as to say that, Inspector, but I've noticed a few peculiarities." Craddock leaned forward. "Go on. Tell me, Inspector, has the name Arthur Devereux come up in your investigation?" Craddock frowned. "Devereux? No, I can't say that it has." "Why?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "'Cause I believe it should have." She proceeded to tell him about Devereux's past, his fraudulent dealings, and his sudden disappearance. Years ago, she explained how Geoffrey Henshaw, now Henry Shaw, had once been Devereux's business partner and had taken the fall for crimes he insisted he had not committed. Craddock listened intently, his expression growing serious. "And you think Devereux is somehow tied to the murders?" "I suspect he is at the very heart of them," Miss Marple said calmly. "Think about it, Inspector. Sylvia Arkwright was attempting to send a telegram the night she died, and Major Endicott had been making inquiries of his own. What if they had discovered something about Devereux, something that put them in danger?" Craddock exhaled sharply. "That would mean Devereux is alive." Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely." The inspector drummed his fingers on the desk. "If you're right, we need to find him, and fast." Miss Marple gave him a knowing look. "I believe he has already been found, Inspector. We simply haven't recognized him yet." Craddock frowned. "You mean he's been hiding in plain sight?" Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled. "I do." Craddock immediately called for his constable. "Bring me everything we have on newcomers to the village in the last 5 years." The constable hurried off, and Miss Marple allowed herself a small sip of tea from the cup Craddock had provided. "I would suggest looking at people who keep to themselves. Someone who is rarely seen, but always listening." Craddock rubbed his chin. "There is one man who fits that description. Mr. Leonard Hayward. Lives on the edge of the village, keeps to himself, says he's a retired banker." Miss Marple smiled. "A banker, you say? How very interesting." Within the hour, Inspector Craddock and his men were at Hayward's cottage. Miss Marple had not accompanied them. Police work required a certain level of authority she did not possess, but she waited patiently at the station. When Craddock returned, his expression was grim. "You were right, Miss Marple. Hayward isn't Hayward at all. He's Arthur Devereux." Miss Marple simply nodded. "And did he confess?" Craddock sighed. "Not exactly, but he was packing his suitcase when we arrived, and he nearly jumped out the back window when he saw us. He knew the game was up." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "Then the question that remains is, did he kill Sylvia Arkwright and Major Endicott?" Craddock rubbed his temples. "He denies it, claims he didn't even know them." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Ah, but that is the trouble with lies, Inspector. They tend to unravel." Craddock nodded. "We found papers in his house, false identities, bank records. He's been moving money around for years, keeping under the radar, but nothing directly tying him to the murders." Miss Marple stood. Then we must look elsewhere for the missing piece, and I believe I know exactly where to find it." Craddock gave her a weary smile. "I don't suppose you'll tell me." Miss Marple chuckled. "Oh, Inspector, that would ruin the fun, wouldn't it?" With that, she took her leave, knowing that the final piece of the puzzle was now within reach. The village of St. Mary Mead was abuzz with the latest development in Mr. Leonard Hayward. The quiet, unassuming man who had lived at the edge of the village for years had been unmasked as Arthur Devereux, a swindler with a past steeped in fraud and deception. But while Inspector Craddock was convinced they had found their man, Miss Marple was not entirely satisfied. Sitting by her window with her knitting in hand, she pondered the case. Arthur Devereux had a great deal to lose if he was discovered, but something about his reaction to the police's arrival troubled her. A man like Devereux, who had spent decades deceiving people, slipping from identity to identity, would surely have had a plan. He had fled, yes, but the panic in his actions suggested he had not anticipated being caught. That, in itself, was curious. Then there was the matter of the telegram. Miss Marple knew, with absolute certainty, that Sylvia Arkwright had uncovered something she was desperate to communicate. If she had wanted to expose Arthur Devereux, why had she chosen a telegram? Why not go directly to the authorities? The answer was simple: because the person she wanted to reach was not in the village. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at her door. It was Mrs. Brent, the postmistress, looking pale and nervous. "Oh, Miss Marple, I just had to come see you. I know you've been asking about that telegram poor Sylvia Arkwright tried to send." Miss Marple set aside her knitting. "Yes, dear. Have you remembered something?" Mrs. Brent nodded vigorously. "It's been bothering me all morning. I went through my records, and I realized something odd. See, when a telegram is canceled, we make a note of it. But Sylvia's message, there's no record of it ever being sent or canceled. It's as if it just vanished." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "That is most peculiar indeed, my dear." "Are you quite certain?" Mrs. Brent nodded. "I'd swear it, Miss Marple. Met just before Sylvia came in that evening. I saw Major Endicott talking to Mr. Shaw. They were having a right serious conversation. They were." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around her knitting needles. "And did you happen to hear what they were discussing?" Mrs. Brent hesitated. "Not exactly, but I remember Major Endicott looking quite upset. Okay, and when Sylvia came in after him, she was in a dreadful hurry." Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile. "Thank you, dear. That is very helpful indeed." After Mrs. Brent had left, Miss Marple sat back in her chair, considering what she had learned. The missing telegram, Major Endicott's urgency, and now the knowledge that he had spoken with Henry Shaw just before. Sylvia's ill-fated attempt to send a message was all coming together. There was one last piece of the puzzle she needed, and for that she would need to pay a visit to Henry Shaw himself. The next morning, Miss Marple walked to Shaw's modest cottage on the outskirts of the village. He greeted her at the door with polite surprise. "Miss Marple, what a pleasure. Do come in." She stepped inside, taking in the simple but well-kept home. Shaw gestured to a chair, and she sat, her hands neatly folded in her lap. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you, Mr. Shaw," she said pleasantly. "I was just reflecting on poor Sylvia Arkwright's fate and found myself thinking about the matter of her telegram." Shaw stiffened slightly. "Her telegram, Keys. You see, it appears that it was never officially recorded. Isn't that strange?" Shaw forced a chuckle. "Well, I suppose mistakes happen." Miss Marple studied him keenly. "Indeed. But then there's also the fact that she was seen speaking with you that evening, along with Major Endicott." Shaw's face darkened. "I don't see what that has to do with anything," Miss Marple continued, her tone light but unyielding. "Oh, but I do, Mr. Shaw, because I believe Sylvia was trying to warn someone about something she and Major Endicott had uncovered." Shaw stood abruptly. "Miss Marple, I don't appreciate these insinuations." Miss Marple remained seated, entirely unruffled. "I dare say you don't, Mr. Shaw, but the truth has a way of surfacing, you know. It always does." Shaw's jaw tightened. "You should leave." Miss Marple rose gracefully. "Of course, but before I do, let me leave you with one final thought. A tea." She met his gaze steadily. If Arthur Devereux did not kill Sylvia Arkwright and Major Endicott, then who did? She turned and left, hearing the sharp intake of breath from behind her. She stepped onto the cobbled path. She allowed herself a small smile. She had just set the final trap. Now, all she had to do was wait. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind alight with possibilities. Henry Shaw's reaction had been most revealing. He had not simply been defensive, he had been afraid. The distinction was crucial. A guilty man, if properly cornered, would often lash out in anger or attempt to divert suspicion. Fear, however, suggested something else. It suggested that he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. She resumed her knitting, allowing the repetitive motion to aid her thoughts. If Shaw was involved in Sylvia Arkwright's murder, then what of Major Endicott? His death, too, was suspicious. A man who had been the picture of health suddenly collapsing after a seemingly trivial accident. It would be foolish to ignore the possibility of poison. Just as she was considering this further, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She rose to find Inspector Craddock standing on her doorstep, his expression grim. "Miss Marple," he said by way of greeting, stepping inside at her invitation. "I have to say, this case is proving to be more tangled than I initially thought. We caught Arthur Devereux, but something doesn't sit right." Miss Marple gestured for him to take a seat. "Tell me, dear boy, what troubles you?" Craddock sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Is the way things fell into place too easy? Devereux fled. Yes, but he's a fraud, not a murderer. I've spoken to him, and unless he's the best actor I've ever met, I don't believe he killed Sylvia Arkwright." Miss Marple nodded, pleased that the inspector's instincts had led him in the right direction. "Quite agree." Craddock shot her a look. "I should have known you'd already reached that conclusion. So, if not Devereux, then who?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside. Sylvia was trying to send a telegram. "That is the key to everything." Craddock frowned. "I know, but we still don't know what she was trying to say." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Not yet, but I have a feeling we will soon." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk through the village, making her way to the vicarage. The Reverend Leonard Clement was in his study, poring over his sermon notes when she arrived. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed warmly. Delightful surprise. She accepted his offer of tea and settled into a chair. "Okay, won't take up much of your time, Reverend, but I was wondering, do you recall if Sylvia Arkwright attended church regularly?" The vicar thought for a moment. "Oh yes, quite regularly. She was a kind girl, very involved in the community." Miss Marple nodded. "And did she ever speak to you in confidence? Perhaps about something troubling her?" The vicar hesitated. "She did, actually. A few days before she died, she came to me, quite distressed. She said she had discovered something dreadful and didn't know what to do." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Did she tell you what it was?" He sighed. "No, I'm afraid she was quite vague. But she did mention one thing. She said she had seen something she wasn't supposed to see." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "And did she mention anyone by name?" The vicar hesitated before nodding. "Yes, she mentioned Henry Shaw." Miss Marple sat back, her mind racing. It all fit. Sylvia had discovered something incriminating about Shaw, something dangerous enough that she felt compelled to send a telegram, but before she could, she was silenced. Miss Marple rose with a smile. "Thank you, Reverend. Been most helpful." As she walked back to her cottage, the pieces began falling into place. Shaw had panicked when she mentioned the telegram. His fear, his defensiveness, it all pointed to one conclusion. But there was still one last detail to confirm, and for that, she would need to pay another visit to Inspector Craddock. Inspector Craddock paced the length of his office, his brow furrowed in thought. Across from him, Miss Marple sat primly, her hands resting on her lap, the picture of quiet patience. Outside, The village of St. Mary Mead continued its daily rhythms, unaware that the final piece of a murder puzzle was about to fall into place. "So," Craddock said at last, stopping in front of her, "you believe Henry Shaw is our man?" Miss Marple nodded. "Quite certainly. You see, Inspector, Sylvia Arkwright was not the sort of young woman to involve herself in criminal affairs. But she was observant, and she knew something important enough that she felt she had to send a telegram." Craddock sat down heavily. "But what did she see?" "We still don't know what was in that telegram." Miss Marple smiled. "But we do, dear boy. We have all the information we need. We simply have to put it together." She folded her hands in her lap, her voice gentle yet unwavering. Sylvia had taken a part-time job assisting at the post office, had she not? Craddock nodded. "That's right, and she worked late on the night she died." Another nod. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Now, let us consider what that means. The post office handles not only letters, but telegrams, urgent messages, confidential ones. Suppose Sylvia happened to read a telegram she was not meant to see." Craddock's eyes sharpened. "Go on." Miss Marple's expression grew serious. "A telegram is an efficient way to communicate, but also a dangerous one if the message falls into the wrong hands. Sylvia must have seen something, perhaps an address, a name that alarmed her. She attempted to send her own telegram to warn someone, but before she could do so, she was killed." Craddock frowned. "But who was the telegram meant for?" Marple's eyes twinkled. "That, Inspector, is where we turn our attention to Major Endicott." Craddock exhaled sharply. "The Major. You believe his death was linked to Sylvia's murder?" "Oh yes," Miss Marple said firmly. "And I believe Henry Shaw is at the center of it all." The Major's death was not a coincidence. It was a necessity. She paused, letting the words sink in. Sylvia must have seen a telegram meant for Major Endicott, something that revealed a dangerous truth. She realized he was in danger and tried to warn him, but Shaw, realizing the risk, killed her first. Then, when it became clear that the Major was still a threat, he arranged for his death as well. Craddock stood abruptly. "Good Lord. Poison. That's why the Major's collapse seemed so sudden." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Precisely. A carefully administered dose, perhaps in a drink. Something that would make his death appear natural. But Shaw made a mistake." Craddock grabbed his hat. "We have to bring him in." Henry Shaw was found at his home, attempting to hastily pack a suitcase. When Craddock and his men arrived, his face turned ashen. "I don't know what this is about," he stammered. Craddock's expression was grim. "We think you do." Miss Marple watched as the inspector stepped forward. "Sylvia Arkwright read a telegram, didn't she? One meant for Major Endicott. She saw something she wasn't supposed to see, and you couldn't risk her telling anyone." Shaw's hands clenched at his sides. "You have no proof." Miss Marple spoke then, her voice soft yet piercing. "You made a fatal error, Mr. Shaw. You assumed Sylvia had sent the telegram before you killed her. But she hadn't, and when you realized the telegram was never sent, you panicked." Shaw's breath came in quick, shallow bursts. "That's nonsense." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Is it? Then why were you so nervous when I mentioned it the other day?" Craddock took a step forward. "We had your late wife's remains examined, Shaw. There were traces of digitalis in her system." Shaw's face twisted. "That was an accident." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Mr. Shaw. It was murder. Like Sylvia Arkwright. Just like Major Endicott." For a moment, Shaw stood frozen. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, he lunged for the door. Craddock was faster. The inspector grabbed him, pinning his arms behind his back. "It's over," Craddock said grimly. "You're under arrest." As Shaw was led away, Miss Marple sighed, returning to her knitting. "A dreadful business," she murmured. Craddock shook his head. And yet, if not for you, he might have gotten away with it. Miss Marple smiled. My dear boy, one only has to pay attention. The answers are always there. And with that, she returned to her quiet life in St. Mary Mead, the puzzle of the unsent telegram finally solved.